Good afternoon, everybody. I want to call this hearing to order. Apologize for the delay. Obviously, we had a vote, and sometimes that gets or that messes us up when it comes to hearings. But I very much appreciate everybody coming out today, and particularly to our very distinguished panel of witnesses that are testifying today. And I very much appreciate your participation. Today, we have an opportunity to hear from 3 key federal agencies on their efforts to expand broadband access to small businesses all across America. These agencies play an important role in developing the policies and programs aimed at incentivizing broadband deployment by the private sector. Access to broadband has the potential to transform the way small businesses operate and compete in today's economy, and it provides small firms the opportunity to utilize a variety of new tools to help reduce costs and increase productivity. Email, online marketing, video conferencing, and access to cloud computing are just a few of the myriad of examples. And moreover, access to high-speed internet is a catalyst for economic growth and entrepreneurship, especially in our rural areas. While it's easy to understand the benefits of broadband internet, those capabilities would not be available for the contributions of private internet providers. And earlier this year, our Subcommittee on Healthcare Technology, chaired by Ms. Elmers, held a hearing on this subject with private carriers and users. The consensus response we heard, and will continue to hear today, I'm sure, is the need for regulatory certainty. They need to know what regulatory changes are coming and when, so that they can obviously make the necessary adjustments to their business operations. And this brings me to a couple of very key important points. First, when agencies consider new policies like reforming the Universal Service Fund, we need to ensure that these changes don't diminish the incentives for private sector investment to deploy broadband. And second, I encourage you to accelerate the supply of spectrum for wireless providers to keep up with the growing demand. The boom in wireless smartphones and tablets has created an absolute new market of innovation and capabilities for small businesses that have to continue. Without private sector investment in broadband infrastructure, many small firms in rural areas like my area in northwest Missouri will be disconnected from one of the most powerful tools of our generation, which will in turn hamper their success, obviously. So again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. I very much look forward to your testimony, and I'll now yield to Ranking Member Velasquez for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. Today's hearing will offer an opportunity to examine the benefits and challenges of broadband deployment. The technology and telecommunication sectors are substantial contributors to the U.S. economy and an engine for growth. Opportunities in this industry are likely to expand as the build-out of broadband and new wireless networks continues. Collectively, investments are projected to generate between more than 300,000 jobs and contribute over $70 billion in GDP growth. Our nation's small firms stand ready to capture many of these economic gains. Innovation is leading the way in today's economy, and small companies are at the forefront. Not only does broadband facilitate innovation by small firms, it allows them to use the most cutting-edge products available. More small businesses are embracing broadband than ever before, and it is rapidly changing the way business is conducted. Innovative applications and services such as video conferencing are helping small companies reduce costs, increase productivity, and expand their businesses into new competitive markets. Firms can save more than $16,000 in startup costs just by conducting activities online. We have seen the benefits broadband technology can bring to our daily lives in a variety of ways. Those fortunate enough to have access to broadband know how it improves efficiency and reduces costs. Because of a lack of network infrastructure, rural and low-income community access is being outpaced by the rest of the country. Unfortunately, the adoption gap may further widen without adequate support for broadband deployment. Eliminating the digital divide is vital not only to assisting rural and low-income communities, but also helping our nation's job creators. By making the virtual marketplace more accessible, more entrepreneurs can grow their companies and invest in hiring. Recovery Act loan and grant benefits are twofold. As disadvantaged businesses are building their networks and expanding their services, small businesses and communities gain access to high-speed internet. In the long term, this results in attracting more businesses, lower unemployment rates, and skilled workers. However, these programs have not been enough to completely overcome the cost issue small businesses face. As we learned during the committee's February hearing, broadband availability continues to be a challenge in some communities, both rural and urban. We even heard how recent USF and ICC reforms have proven difficult for many of the nation's small rural carriers. This hearing will focus on improving broadband access in order to strengthen the small business economy. The insights gathered today will ensure that policies coming out of Congress are effectively supporting network deployment without burdening small telecom providers. This committee will also make certain that the needs of small firms are taken into account in upcoming spectrum auctions and in moving forward with U.S. reform. In advance of the testimony, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Before I get started, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to recognize my daughter, who's in the hearing room today and just starting law school this fall, and this is the first time she's been to one of the Small Business Committee hearings, and I appreciate her being here today. And with that, I want to introduce our first witness, the Honorable Julius Genachowski, who's Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Chairman Genachowski was confirmed by the Senate in 2009 and oversees an agency of over 1,700 employees, which is responsible for regulating interstate and international communication. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Velasquez, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm pleased to join my Federal partners, NTIA Administrator Strickling and RUS Administrator Adelstein. My primary focus as FCC Chairman has been promoting innovation, investment, competition, and consumers in the communications and technology sector. We focus the agency on maximizing the benefits of broadband communications and on helping harness wired and wireless broadband to grow our economy, enhance U.S. competitiveness, and create jobs, as well as advancing important goals like improved education, healthcare, and public safety. A key element of our strategy has been empowering small businesses. As this committee well knows, American small businesses are key drivers of economic growth and job creation. Broadband is increasingly important to the future of small businesses. It enables small businesses to grow and jobs to be created anywhere, not only in urban markets, but in small rural towns all over the country. Broadband allows small businesses to market their products and reach customers in the next neighborhood, the next city, the next state, and even overseas, increasing their revenue. And broadband allows small businesses to lower their costs through cloud-based services. Increased revenue, lower costs, more profits, more jobs. More than 1 million entrepreneurs, a large percent of which are small businesses, are already selling products on eBay, Amazon, and other platforms, but of course doing so requires broadband access. Over the past 3 years, the FCC has taken a number of actions to help more small businesses seize the opportunities of broadband. Let's start with universal service reform. Today, about 18 million Americans, including many small business owners, live in areas where they can't get broadband. But the Universal Service Fund we inherited was not addressing that gap. It was optimized for telephone service, not broadband. It had become inefficient and even wasteful, sending money, for example, to multiple providers in one community and none to other communities. And it didn't have adequate accountability, allowing recipients to control their own funding spigot. Last December, I'm proud that the FCC unanimously approved a once-in-a-generation overhaul of the Universal Service Fund, transforming this 20th century program that supported phone service into a 21st century, fiscally responsible Connect America Fund that supports broadband. These reforms put us on a path to connect all unserved Americans and small businesses by 2020. And just last week, one provider, Frontier, announced that it will be deploying broadband to about 200,000 unserved Americans as part of these reforms. These reforms will also help ensure that consumers, including small businesses paying into the fund, get a fair bang for their buck. FCC staff estimates that roughly a quarter of all universal service contributions are paid by small businesses, over $2 billion per year. That's one reason we've set out to eliminate waste and inefficiency throughout USF. Our efforts to expand broadband access are complementary to the important work to ensure broadband availability being done by NTIA and RUS. These cooperative efforts with our Federal partners are helping more small businesses seize the opportunities of broadband. The Commission is also taking a number of steps to help small businesses access the productivity and marketing tools of mobile broadband. The new Mobility Fund, which was established as part of our universal service reform, will spur the build-out of advanced mobile networks in unserved rural areas. We're working tirelessly to free up more spectrum for mobile broadband. The incentive auction legislation that Congress passed recently is a very important step forward. We're identifying other areas where we can remove regulatory barriers on spectrum use to free up spectrum for mobile broadband. And we're working closely with NTIA on new strategies to free up more government spectrum for commercial mobile broadband. We've also freed up a very significant amount of unlicensed spectrum on the market, which is an important platform for innovation for small businesses. And we can help small businesses not only by making sure they have access to broadband, by also helping ensure they have the basic digital skills to use online resources and applications. That's why the FCC, working with the Small Business Administration, created a public-private partnership to leverage SCORE, SBA's network of more than 10,000 volunteer business counselors, to provide broadband tools, training, and support for small businesses. We're working with the industry to address the digital divide. Also, our rules, Connect to Compete, is a new program that will help families with children on school lunch programs get a low-cost broadband for under $10 a month. Working with the Small Business Administration, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Urban League, and private companies, we also are addressing cybersecurity and public safety issues in this area, which is important for trust and security. We developed a cybersecurity tip sheet and small business cyber planner describing a number of common sense steps that small businesses can take to improve their security. We worked with ISPs to develop steps, including a botnet code of conduct that now 90% of all ISPs are putting in place to address cybersecurity concerns, which have a particularly negative impact potentially on small businesses. Through our public safety responsibilities, the Commission also aids small businesses. The recent storm that caused significant power and communications outages in the Mid-Atlantic region cost small businesses and consumers severely and knocked out vital emergency communications. The FCC coordinated with FEMA and others to assess and respond to the outages, and immediately after restoration, we launched an investigation into the Mid-Atlantic outages so that we can better avoid these problems in the future. We are now expanding that investigation to seek public comment from a broad set of stakeholders with the goal of identifying the necessary steps to make our communications and emergency services nationwide reliable and resilient. We take seriously the directives of the President and Congress to minimize the impact of our rules on small businesses. We always consider the impact on small businesses, and we've eliminated many regulations that are unnecessary, and we've exempted small businesses from many requirements that we do have. Spurred by small businesses, we've had a lot of good news in our broadband sector in the last 3 years. The Chairman and the Ranking Member mentioned some of them. The apps economy, which is largely driven by small businesses, has already created nearly 500,000 jobs around the country. For all our progress, there are still real challenges ahead, including the spectrum crunch, which the Chairman mentioned, that threatens to stifle mobile innovation and commerce, the need to drive continued improvements in broadband speeds and capacity, and the broadband adoption gap, the digital divide that leaves tens of millions of customers out of reach of small businesses. I look forward to working with the members of this committee on all of these issues and to answering your questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Our next witness is the Honorable Jonathan Adelstein, Administrator of the Rural Utilities Service at the United States Department of Agriculture. He was confirmed in July of 2009 as the 17th Administrator of the RUS. In his role, he oversees a $60 billion portfolio of rural electric, water, and telecommunications infrastructure loans. Thank you for being here, Administrator. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Velazquez and members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to testify on an issue of such high priority, expanding broadband access. I'm especially thrilled to join my friends, Chairman Julius Janikowski and Administrator Larry Strickling. Over the last several years, we've really been partners in building out broadband as far and wide as we can in this country to carry out the President's vision of connecting all Americans, no matter where they live, to next-generation broadband networks. I congratulate the Chairman for moving on USF reform. As he indicated, having tried during my time on the Commission, I know it's no easy feat. I look forward to continuing to work together as that process moves forward. We share a common goal amongst us of maximizing Americans' access to broadband. This administration, including USDA, has made historic investments resulting in stronger rural communities and a stronger rural economy. In this effort, RUS is America's infrastructure bank. We're also the first and longest serving, having brought rural electrification to the countryside and continuing to today's technology challenge, getting broadband out. Our $65 to $60 billion loan portfolio represents key investments in the foundation of rural America's future prosperity, its utilities networks. The small business and cooperative models work very efficiently to deliver utility services. RUS telecom programs are available to any service provider, large or small, but it turns out that the vast bulk of our private sector borrowers are in fact small businesses serving small communities. They in turn provide broadband to small businesses, and they also use a network of technology and service vendors who themselves are also often small businesses. This virtual cycle, I think, really exemplifies public programs seeding private sector growth. RUS borrowers are pillars of their communities. They lead local and regional economic development. I know you're familiar with them in your districts. You've seen the kind of work that they do. Businesses they help to spawn are often also financed by our sister agency, USDA's Rural Business Service, which provides loans and grants for them to develop. A big challenge faces all of us on this panel. America's appetite for bandwidth and speed is exploding, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, in your statement. As the Internet becomes more mobile and more video intensive, businesses are using the Internet in new and innovative ways to create jobs, markets, and wealth. And we've all worked very hard to try to keep up with the bandwidth demands that are growing and ahead of our foreign competitors to keep high-wage jobs here at home. We need to meet the escalating demands for commercial and public safety communications. Now, bandwidth benefits rural areas in especially profound and many different ways. It erases the disadvantages of density and distance. It opens new markets for small and large businesses. It connects our kids to advanced education. It gives everyone access to expert medical advice and treatment via telemedicine. Since 1949, my agency, RUS, has invested more than $22 billion in rural telecom systems, and our current outstanding balance exceeds $4 billion, and it's growing rapidly with Recovery Act projects as they come online. And those RUS Recovery Act projects will provide broadband to nearly 7 million people, 364,000 businesses, many of them small businesses, and 32,000 anchor institutions like schools and libraries and hospitals. These projects are on track and on schedule. We provide affordable financing to capital-intensive projects, but we also provide engineering standards, careful scrutiny, and continuing oversight. RUS programs have created jobs and economic opportunity and provided, I think, an excellent value to the American taxpayer. As a matter of fact, our largest telecommunications program operates with no federal budget authority. We pay back at virtually every dime. Our ability to lend is linked to the availability of reliable sources of revenue and the willingness of the private sector to invest. Because after all, we're their partner, but it's the private sector that makes these decisions. And those revenues come from three sources: customer charges, payments among service providers, and universal service support. Private sector investment depends on the predictability and sufficiency of those revenues. And while the FCC's USF reform effort remains a work in progress, we're pleased the FCC is trying new approaches to further close rural coverage gaps in areas served by the larger carriers that haven't had the benefit of universal service in RUS in the past. Much like our considerably smaller Community Connect program and elements of the Recovery Act, the FCC's new Connect America Fund infuses new capital to support broadband expansion. As we move to a reform system, we face the challenge of preserving and advancing the gains already achieved. RUS is the most successful role model in charting investments that have delivered real and significant gains in rural broadband expansion. Each loan or grant is highly scrutinized by RUS staff, both in Washington and in the field and across the country. Each delivers broadband as promised. Every RUS dollar has a name and address on it. We know where the dollars are invested, and we don't want to spend a penny more than necessary. Our approach is long-term and focused on building it right the first time. Broadband not only improves the quality of life for rural Americans, it lifts the entire U.S. economy and spurs unparalleled economic development opportunities. It allows us to insource jobs rather than outsource them. Expanding broadband service makes our nation stronger, more connected, and truly more united. Thank you for your leadership on promoting broadband and small businesses, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Administrator. Our final witness is the Honorable Lawrence Strickling, the Assistant Secretary of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration of the Department of Commerce. He's confirmed in June of 2009 and directs the agency responsible for advising the President and Executive Branch on telecommunication and information policy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also like to acknowledge Ranking Member Velasquez and other members of the committee. And I thank you for the invitation to testify today regarding NTIA's work to expand and strengthen broadband access to small businesses. I also am pleased to be here with Chairman Janikowski and Administrator Adelstein, who have been long-term partners with us as we move toward accomplishing these goals. Expanding the availability and adoption of broadband in America is a key element of building the innovation economy of the future. In the near term, investments in broadband infrastructure help create jobs and grow businesses through the construction of fiber optic networks, wireless towers, and other high-tech components. And our Recovery Act-funded public computer centers and sustainable broadband adoption initiatives provide much-needed job training for out-of-work Americans. In the longer term, expanding broadband access and adoption facilitates economic growth and innovation, especially for small businesses, and lays a foundation for long-term economic development in communities throughout the country. The positive impact of broadband on the economic health of small business is clear. A 2010 report by the Small Business Administration found that Internet plays an integral role in helping small businesses achieve their strategic goals, improve competitiveness and efficiency, and interact with customers and vendors. Surveys of small businesses confirm that they find high-speed Internet as essential to their business as other basic services such as water and electricity. The research firm Strategic Networks Group has collected data from more than 15,000 U.S. businesses and found that while broadband accounts for approximately 20% of new jobs across all businesses, it is responsible for 30% of new jobs in small businesses. Our most important initiative at NTIA to improve broadband capabilities for small businesses is the Broadband Grant Program created by the Recovery Act. We've provided $4 billion in grants to 230 recipients to expand broadband availability and adoption in the United States. About 20% of our grant recipients, representing nearly $800 million in grant dollars, are small businesses. To date, all of our grantees have deployed or upgraded more than 57,000 miles of broadband infrastructure. They've connected more than 8,000 community anchor institutions to high-speed broadband service. They've installed more than 33,000 workstations in public computer centers. They've provided more than 7 million hours of technology training to approximately 2 million users. And they have funded more than 4,000 jobs in the second quarter of fiscal year 2012. To give you an example of how a small business is serving its community through one of our grants, let me describe Show Me Technologies in Missouri. Show Me is using nearly $27 million of Recovery Act funds to deploy 500 miles of new fiber, completing a 1,400-mile network across 30 counties in the south and central parts of the state. It is already providing new or upgraded service to 48 community anchor institutions in Missouri, such as schools, libraries, and courthouses. In Ohio, another small business, ComNet, is using its $30 million of Recovery Act funds to install about 700 miles of high-capacity fiber in its network in 28 western counties of the state. And this project hopes to serve more than 800 community anchor institutions. Our requirement of open access to Recovery Act-funded networks is helping to prime the pump for additional investment by public and private entities, including many small businesses. Recipients have already entered into nearly 400 interconnection agreements with third-party providers, which will reduce their costs of bringing last-mile service directly to homes and businesses. For example, the Massachusetts Broadband Institute has already signed agreements with several last-mile providers, including Crocker Communications, a small woman-owned telecommunications provider in Greenfield, Massachusetts. And the town of Leverett says it wants to invest $3.6 million in a last-mile fiber-to-the-home network that will utilize the middle-mile facilities funded by NTIA. NTIA is also helping small businesses by expanding public computer centers, which provide training that can help individuals find jobs, create new businesses, and impact their local economies. For example, public computer centers in West Virginia and Missouri report that people are using their NTIA-funded centers to start and manage their own small businesses. And the job training provided by the California Emerging Technology Fund has helped over 1,000 people find jobs. These examples are just a few of the small businesses that are benefiting from our broadband investments. And as we perform our mission to expand broadband access and adoption, we expect small businesses, the engine of our economy, to be a particular beneficiary of the innovation economy of the future and the new and better jobs it will create for all Americans. So I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strickland. And we will start with questions today, and I'm going to lead off with Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last November, the FCC reported in 7th Broadband Progress Report and Order on Reconsideration that about 100 million Americans still do not have broadband in their homes. This is about a third of our population and is extremely troubling, especially in light of the fact that the U.S. is now competing in a global economy. In Colorado, the state legislature commissioned the state's first ever broadband mapping project and concluded that while almost every household in Metro Denver can subscribe to broadband service, in the 15 most rural counties, most of which happen to be in my district, broadband availability is less than 80%. In the same report, Custer County in my district had the lowest rate at 56%. And this is unacceptable. The Census Bureau has reported that from 1998 to 2009, online annual sales grew from $4.9 billion to $145 billion. In his testimony, Chairman Janikowski cited a study that pointed out that having a broadband connection makes $200,000 a year in difference in the median annual revenues for businesses. Unfortunately, in Colorado, many of the areas where unemployment is at the highest also have the least amount of broadband connectivity. This is more than just a coincidence. We must now ensure that resources are made available outside of the suburban areas so that we can get this broadband access into rural America and communities, thereby increasing opportunities for small businesses and be able to create jobs. Given some of the budgetary limitations that we have in order to accomplish this, I believe we must think outside the box. And to that end, Chairman, I would like to encourage you to enact guidelines that provide for private investments into expanding the rural broadband access in conjunction with more efficiently using some of the taxpayer funds that we currently have through the FCC to better serve some of these broadband needs. And Chairman, thank you for being here. I would like to ask you a couple of questions in regards to actually being able to deliver a service. In La Plata County and Montezuma County, in my district, they're known as orphan counties and are part of the Albuquerque designated markets, which falls under the FCC. Because of their location and distance, we are not able to receive Colorado television. Do you think it's important for residents of a state to also receive weather, emergency, and sporting programs from the same state that they reside in? And if so, would you pledge to be able to work with me today to be able to assist bringing these Colorado communities in their entirety into that spectrum?
Yes, first of all, thank you for the focus in your initial comments on both the important needs to address broadband deployment gaps and broadband adoption gaps. I agree with what you said. We're focused on it. With respect to broadcast television, I think we saw recently in the weather situation that we had in this area that all forms of communications to consumers are incredibly important. In any disaster, some will go down, others will stay up, and so making sure that whether it's by TV, radio, the Internet, mobile, consumers are connected, both for our economy and for public safety. It's vitally important, and I look forward to working with you on the issue you mentioned.
Great. I certainly appreciate that. And, you know, you did speak to public safety. Recent legislation was put into place, and we had several test markets. In the state of Colorado, we had in Adams County, where they were putting in their own public safety broadband systems. And as you know, the FCC granted waivers for these systems to use the 700 megahertz spectrum. There now appears to be some question as to whether this early deployment of the public safety broadband networks will be allowed to be able to move forward. And I understand that NTIA has asked that you terminate these waivers pending waiver applications. Do you continue to believe, as stated in the FCC order granting public safety waivers, that these projects serve as test beds and can provide valuable lessons as we work toward deploying this national network? And additionally, do you believe that the interoperability commitments made by the waiver guarantees can be leveraged to be able to ensure that these systems will be interoperable and integrated into the national network?
We're working closely with NTIA on these issues. Congress, of course, in its incentive auction law, also, to its credit, finally funded a national interoperable mobile broadband public safety network for first responders. It's a very important thing. it directed the creation of a single network. And so now in implementing that law, we're working closely with NTIA on the waiver situations to make sure that we support the goals of the legislation and get one network up and running, while also recognizing circumstances in particular areas. And of course, we're looking at the one that you mentioned, and make sure that we act in an appropriate way consistent with the public interest and consistent with the law.
Great. And Mr. Adelson, real quickly, you'd mentioned the ERA program and that $3.5 billion in broadband loans, grants, and guarantees had gone out. Can you tell us how much of that actually went into rural America?
Yes. Virtually all of it went to rural America. We have $2 billion under contract, and the law permitted up to 75% to be rural, 25% non-rural, but virtually all of our projects were in rural areas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Janikowski, the FCC has provided a USF waiver process for small carriers, but many companies believe the process is burdensome and too restrictive. Could you please walk us through the waiver process and the documents required of applicants, and also have you taken the concerns of these providers? Did you consider them when you were considering how the waiver was designed?
Yes, and thank you for that question. It's been widely recognized for some time that Universal Service Fund needed to be reformed from telephone to broadband, from inefficient to efficient. As we were doing those reforms, we had three goals in mind. One was finally getting broadband to unserved areas. A second was being fiscally responsible and cognizant of the consumers and small businesses paying money into the fund. And the third is recognizing business realities on the ground. And we created the waiver process because we recognized that reform is challenging and that specific situations would come up. And of course, we're paying close attention to those waiver requests. In general, what's required in the waiver requests is the basic financial information that we would need, similar to what Administrator Adelstein said, to evaluate a waiver request to make sure that money is going where it should be going, that money isn't being wasted. We have, I think, about 9 waiver requests now. We're taking those very seriously, while also focusing on the consumers and small businesses paying into the fund.
Did you hear those concerns from small carriers?
Yes.
They were restrictive?
The concerns are what led us to create the waiver process. And now we're working very closely with the carriers to make sure that we have a waiver process that's both efficient and as least burdensome as possible, while also making sure that we're protecting the money that's in the fund.
Okay. I have to share with you that we have been contacted by a lot of those small carriers expressing concerns that the process is quite burdensome. Mr. Adelstein, RUS generally will not award a loan to an entity to compete with an existing RUS borrower, mainly to protect that borrower and not affect their ability to repay the loan. So my question is it fair for RUS to subsidize a competitor to an existing provider?
We do our best to focus on our funding where there is not an existing provider. As a matter of fact, Congress provided in the Farm Bill of 2008 some very clear guidelines to limit any overlap. Occasionally, broadband doesn't follow neat lines, and there are times when, in order to have adequate revenues in order to repay a loan, a network will go through an area that may be partially covered, but that's in order to enable them to finance to those areas that don't have broadband, the more rural areas. Some providers will stop at the town line and won't make it out to rural areas, and as they're building out their network with our loan, they may include the town in order to make that work financially.
You know, this is an issue that has been raised by the Inspector General, where it shows that almost 31% of the agency loans serve to foster competition in some areas that are already being served.
The Inspector General report concerned statutory requirements from 2002. Actually, we have closed out all of the concerns that were raised by the IG. Under this administration, we put the program on hiatus while we evaluated to ensure that it was going to the most rural parts of the country. During the pendency of the Recovery Act, we didn't do any loans under it, and so far we have not done a number of loans, and none of them came under the IG's purview. So we have actually closed out that IG audit and have addressed each of the concerns that were raised by the IG back in 2005.
Okay. Mr. Strickland and Mr. Alderson, isn't it only fair that before awarding any broadband loan or grant money, RUS and NTIA should provide a reasonable opportunity for existing providers to present data to demonstrate that an area is already served?
Absolutely. And in the 2 rounds of funding that we did in 2009 and 2010, we provided carriers or anyone else exactly that opportunity.
So you do that now?
We haven't given a grant since September 30th, 2010. That was the deadline under the Recovery Act to make all grants.
Okay.
And we also gave all carriers the opportunity to publicly announce where they were providing service, if there was any overlap. We didn't just take their word for it, though. We sent our general field representatives and our field staff in to double check to make sure there wasn't broadband there.
And there is a process for anyone to protest?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and going forward, we've adopted that model for our broadband program that I talked about. We had on hiatus so that we have now the opportunity for individuals to contact us regarding any potential overlapping service areas.
Mr. Janikowski, special access remains an issue important to small carriers. It is also one that the FCC hesitates, if I could describe it that way, to take action on. So a March 2011 report found that if special access is provided, prices come down, it will stimulate the economy and create close to 100,000 jobs. Can you tell me why the FCC is not overhauling the rules governing special access?
Well, this is an important area.
Well, it is so important that the process started in 2005 and still it hasn't gone anywhere.
It has been going somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
We initiated a voluntary data request some time ago. That data is in. We're moving forward together with our colleagues now on the next level of understanding the situation and moving forward. What drives us is exactly what you said, and I agree with it. For small businesses, where a lack of competition is leading to increased prices, that has real negative effects on our economy. The challenge is distinguishing between the areas where there is competition and the areas where there aren't, and that's the work that we need to do in terms of compiling data and then acting.
And so in terms of the foreseeable future, when do you think you're going to be acting upon special access?
We expect to take the next step in the next weeks. We're working hard at it, and it's toward the top of our agenda.
Special weeks?
Several weeks.
Several weeks? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Landry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Janikowski, I'm really concerned about the impact of the USF reforms on small carriers. In making these reforms, is it possible that investments by some of these small carriers that were made in 2010 or before under the prior rules or now, that those investments that they made in 2010 or prior, could they be penalized for those investments today?
The challenge we have relates to the discussion topic before. Historically, the program we inherited did provide funding in areas where there were a number of different companies receiving federal subsidies, or provided subsidies to a company where there was an unsubsidized competitor. And it was an element of our reform to reduce that, to phase it out over time so that we could use that money.
So it is possible that some of the investments that they made under the prior rules, now that you changed the rules, could affect their investment now.
It is possible.
Could it put them out of business?
I don't think so, and we are working with the carriers on this transition.
And like in which way are you working with them?
We set up a waiver process that was mentioned before. We're being cognizant of business realities on the ground, and we're working very hard to get the balance right between being trustees of the public money that's being spent and recognizing the business realities on the ground.
Well, let me ask you this question. This waiver process that you spoke about earlier, what do you think it would cost a small carrier to go through the process?
I wouldn't estimate, I couldn't estimate the cost. I'd be happy to follow up with you.
I mean, $10, $20, $30 or thousands of dollars, or tens of thousands of dollars, or hundreds of thousands of dollars?
I'd be hesitate to make that recommendation. These are companies
do you think it would cost in excess of $100,000?
I think it would cost a very small fraction of the millions of dollars of public money that they're receiving, and so making sure that we are insisting on accountability.
And have you designed this waiver process so that it's simplistic and it's streamlining? I mean, do you know how many pages it consists of?
That is our goal. That is what we are trying to do. In many cases, the filings are large because they include pre-existing documents like financial reports and other information.
This is the waiver process, Mr. Chairman. I got a company in my district that has already spent over $124,000. They still haven't been able to complete the process. They are telling me that if they don't get the waiver, they're going out of business. That affects my rural residents down in South Louisiana, some of whom live on a very challenging part of our country out in the coastal areas where communication is necessary, especially during hurricane season. I'm trying to understand how sometimes this administration comes here and says, oh, we fought the small businesses, oh, we're doing everything we can to help them, oh, I'm telling you it's going to be okay, and you leave us with this warm and fuzzy feeling that it's being taken care of. But yet, this doesn't look like a waiver process that's simple. And $124,000 is not chump change. I mean, can't y'all do, and this is going to affect these carriers today.
I recognize your point. In my experience, most of the documents that are submitted to us are documents that have already been prepared, financial reports, other things that we need to do to enforce fiscal responsibility and accountability.
Well, but does the exemption, does the waiver process, is it a one-year exemption, a two-year exemption? I mean, it seems to me there's not a lot of clarification between the FCC and those small rural carriers. I mean, I've spoken to not just the one in my district, but there's one up in Wyoming, I believe, and some in other parts of the country that are having a problem with this.
And I recognize this is important. We've received about 10 waiver requests. In each case, the companies that are seeking waiver requests want federal subsidies equivalent to between $250 per month per customer to $1,300. And we do need to work with the companies to make sure that that level of spending can be justified.
Well, and it's my understanding that y'all used a model in order to implement these reforms. Do you know what the accuracy of that model is?
We are committed to having it be accurate. It's why we have an ongoing.
Well, no, but do you know what the accuracy of that model is? Because according to according to y'all, the accuracy of that model is 62.34%. I mean, I didn't make good grades in school. I'm going to tell you, I did a little better than 62%. And so my concern again is that you have put a model out there that basically would fail a student in high school, okay? And then you created a waiver process that is unduly burdensome on these small carriers. Can you give us a commitment that y'all going to work with those small carriers to try to reduce the cost and the waiver process and ensure that those carriers continue to be able to provide services in rural areas?
Absolutely. Making sure that consumers don't lose existing service and that the 18 million unserved Americans get service is the fundamental purpose of our reforms.
Okay. If they go out of business, they won't get that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schrader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel for being here. Pretty august panel for Small Business Committee, and appreciate everyone's testimony to date. Anecdotally, I'd like to thank all of you for your deployment of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act money. It's made a huge difference in my district. In the rural parts of my district, got a small town in Jervis that was able to connect up its fire station and rural school, thanks to the stimulus money, and really appreciate, I've got one county that's trying to connect a lot of the public providers in a thoughtful way, drive down costs, working through the tough things, working with our local franchise potential providers too. So it's made a huge difference in a lot of Americans' lives, keeping people alive, keeping people connected, and creating a few jobs. So I want to start with that. And in 2003, it's my understanding, wasn't here at the time, that a pretty bipartisan FCC was able to develop a pretty hands-off but thoughtful approach to fiber, very pro-investment, pro-deployment view of fiber, and resulted in almost 4 times the amount of fiber being laid that was out there before. And I think it takes a while to connect. That middle mile and last mile is always going to be the tough issues, and I know you're struggling through and already have responded to the IG report in 2002. That's really welcome news. So I appreciate all that. I was curious, Mr. Chairman, if the FCC was going to have any new regulations coming down the road for fiber, and what you've been relatively hands-off, but with thoughtful supervision. Where do you see that changing, or what are the next steps?
Ensuring that we preserve and indeed increase the incentives to invest in fiber, invest in mobile, invest in advanced communications infrastructure is a central priority of ours. Over the last few years, that's been successful. Investment both in networks and in applications and services is up, and so the light touch approach is something that we're committed to, as we also look at competition issues that exist that the ranking member mentioned, and make sure that small businesses aren't harmed in areas where there's a lack of competition.
So follow up on that, I guess, from each of the panelists here. Ways to avoid interagency conflicts. I mean, where does NTIA stop? The RUS begin? Can't be telephone back in my district begin? I mean, how are you working through those potential conflicts at this stage to encourage private enterprise?
So in our case, it relates to the grants that we issued back in 2009 and 2010, including one in your district, Clackamas County, I know is one, I think it was one you referred to a minute ago. And so throughout the grant giving part of the program, we were pretty much joined at the hip with NTIA. In fact, the first round of applications were reviewed jointly by both agencies, and we agreed to fund some, and RUS took some to fund. Since then, in round two, we went our separate ways, but in that situation, we focused on funding middle mile applications. RUS focused more on the last mile applications, again, as a way to make sure that we weren't, in effect, duplicating our efforts on the same types of projects. Since then, there have been instances where an RUS recipient and a BTOP or an NTIA recipient have been building in the same areas, and we've had a couple of, or I'm not sure of the exact number, but there have been some incidents where there have been some questions raised as to whether or not we were getting into an area of duplication. In every one of those cases, we have sat down with the parties and with RUS and have worked out those issues, and I'm confident that if any of those appear in the future, we'll do the same.
Thank you.
We do coordinate very closely. I think all three of us have a responsibility in different areas for getting broadband built out, including fiber. 92% of what we do is fiber build. And we are thrilled to have done over $13 million in your district on the Recovery Act. It really was an urgent need of broadband in many places through Monroe, Cascade, Gervais, City of Sandy. Yeah. We are happy to be your partners on that. Larry and I talk all the time as we coordinate. We were just talking in the hall a few minutes ago, as a matter of fact, about one of the projects, and whenever we need to, we get each other on the line. With the FCC, we regularly discuss issues that come up, so long as they are within the scope of what the administration can do vis-a-vis an independent agency. We have a great relationship with the FCC, and we've been their partners long before our tenure in building out broadband in rural America, where universal service enables our loans to be repaid, enables those builds that otherwise wouldn't be possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Last, just a quick comment, a short answer if it's at all possible. Even though the lines are there are some small businesses in some of the rural communities, as we've heard from the ranking member and some of the others in the panel, that aren't able to access or don't access. And what are the barriers to those small businesses and individuals?
Well, the biggest barrier, one of the biggest barriers is access to actual broadband networks. I mean, we find it's very expensive in certain rural areas to do that. Without support, it's not possible.
But they have the access, is my point, but they're not hooking up. Why aren't they hooking up?
I'd be happy to field that. We found a number of different reasons that work together. In some cases, it's cost, too expensive, and that's why we did this Connect to Compete program to find a low-cost tier for where that's an issue. In some cases, it's digital literacy. Not everyone knows how to use a computer, upload information, so we need to address that. In some cases, it's a lack of appreciation of the benefits. Oh, you mean my small business can actually reach customers around the country if I do that, and so we've adopted measures on that. And in some cases, it's trust, which is why the security and privacy issues are important, because that keeps some people away.
Very good. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. West?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thanks for the panel for being here. I want to go back to the regression analysis model for capping the USF support because on the 25th of April implementation order that was sent out, it was acknowledged that there were some errors still with that model. So my first question is, does it concern you that we have implemented a model that we know has some errors as far as this cost, capping recovery methods?
It's a good question. We use the best available data, and sometimes the data is imperfect. In areas where errors are brought to attention, we act quickly. And so there were 2 instances where companies said, hey, wait a minute, this is wrong, and we fixed that within 2 weeks. We understand that this does require cooperation from the companies to do that, but I also worry about the other side, the small businesses and customers paying into the fund, the public money that's being used. These are very important questions. It's our responsibility to get this balance right and insist on accountability without driving businesses crazy.
Sure, and that's what I taught. I talked to Jeff Leslie, who's the President and CEO of Indiantown Telecommunications down in Martin County, and he's very concerned about what you just talked about is, how do they make sure that they're operating with the best possible model out there? Are we working toward eliminating more of these errors? Because obviously they're somewhat behind an 8 ball, and we don't want to see all of a sudden businesses that are, chasing this moving target because we really haven't solidified the errors in this model.
Yes, it is important to us. We're working with the industries, with the principles that I laid out.
Okay. The other concern that Jeff gave to me is that it seems that the caps change every year. Is that correct?
Well,
yes or no?
Not every year. We've put the benchmarks in place. They're settled until 2014, and we're working to determine the best method for the future to provide certainty and predictability while protecting.
Well, that's the key word, certainty and predictability. I think that's a big thing that we're not providing to anyone out there in the private sector. So when you're a small business owner, I mean, you need to have a method by which you can come up with your business plan. So is it troubling for you and also Mr. Edelstein? We're not providing that certainty and predictability out there for them to know these caps year to year so that they can plan out properly?
Respectfully, I'd make 2 points. One is, as the Administrator mentioned, for years it was widely thought that reform was necessary. It didn't happen, and there was a cloud of uncertainty and unpredictability, much of which we've eliminated by moving forward with reform. There's more work to do. There are people who argue that these programs should be eliminated completely, that the simplest way to have predictability and to have predictability and certainty is not to have the government in this business of helping private companies roll out broadband to rural America. I disagree with that, but it does raise these challenges of how to do this in an efficient, market-oriented way that gets the money out to companies in areas that need it while protecting the companies and the business and the people who are putting money into the program.
Do you feel confident with your lending practices when you look at this, uncertainty out there, Mr. Edelstein, as far as, the errors that are in this model and also the year by year? Does that provide you some sense of comfort?
Well, certainty is essential for a lender. I mean, we are basically a financial institution, so we do fairly long-term loans. These projects are very capital intensive, and as a result, we have long amortization periods, up to 20 years. We will give a loan for the life of it to enable a small business to do a large capital build. In order to do long-term loans and planning, we do need visibility going forward as far into the future as we possibly can, as any private lender would.
And that brings me back to doing a hearing on the May 9th at the Senate Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee. Mr. Janikowski, you stated that Congress may have to provide a capital infusion to help the rural utilities cover losses that may be incurred when borrowers default on RUS loans due to the impact of your USF and ICC reforms. I mean, are we talking about a bailout here?
No, not at all. And in our broadband plan several years ago, we suggested that one way to accelerate the transition from to broadband would be a one-time capital infusion. Congress elected not to act, and I completely understand the fiscal responsibility pressures.
Yeah, we're broke.
So totally understand. The funding for broadband that we're providing to unserved communities in your state and in all the states here is coming from the program itself. So for the first time, we put this program on a budget. We did it on a bipartisan basis. It does create challenging implementation issues as we honor fiscal responsibility, and I think all these questions are perfectly appropriate. We're working hard to address them. If money grew on trees, it would be a lot easier. We're wrestling with the reality of the fact that it doesn't.
I'd be a tree farmer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, distinguished members of the panel, for being here today. Chairman Jankowski, the FEC has highlighted the importance of fiber technologies and really stating on several different occasions that fiber technology offers substantially more capacity than copper-based technologies. And according to a 2011 study by Pando Networks, as reported in the New York Times, Rhode Island, my home state, is the state with the fastest average internet speed in the country, and broadband is available to 97% of Rhode Island residents. So part of the reason that my Rhode Island constituents have access to fast, very high-quality internet is due to the fiber optic network that spans our whole state. And there's been obviously an explosion of the fiber deployment and the number of fiber providers. And I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about whether or not the FCC's hands-off framework has really helped to incentivize this deployment and investment across the country, or has it presented a challenge in any particular way?
I think the light touch approach has been very helpful in triggering this, the investment that you mentioned, which is very important. Competition does that as well. Companies invest when they know they have to improve their product and their speeds and capacity, and we are charged by Congress to make sure that these markets remain competitive. But our approach is very consistent with the one you laid out, which is let the market, let competition drive investment, and recognize that this is a global issue, and all the topics we're discussing relate to our global competitiveness.
Thank you. And Assistant Secretary Strickland, thank you for being here as well. I have a grantee in my district that benefit from the Recovery Act broadband grants, the Ocean State Higher Education Economic Development and Administrative Network, or OCEAN, and it is using $21.7 million in American Recovery and Reinvestment broadband funds administered by NTIA to build a fiber optic network that will span over 350 miles in length. And this obviously has huge value and benefits in the creation of the network, but I wondered if you would talk a little bit about what you see as the long-term positive impact on communities of this kind of investment, which is maybe not immediately apparent to everybody when we make these investments.
Sure. So our philosophy in making that grant, and it's a good example of what we call the comprehensive community type of grant that we made primarily in our second round of funding in 2010, where we focused on middle mile build out. We expressly did not look to fund the mass market last mile provision of services, but instead focused it on getting the fiber built from the internet exchange points into communities where then private enterprise could step in and build out and serve the homes and businesses in those communities. As part of the project in Rhode Island, because of the high speed demands of educational institutions, we're also connecting a number of those anchor institutions directly off of the project that's being built in Rhode Island. In terms of how we see this playing out, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks, we really think this is priming the pump for private investment in the sense that the government has provided funding to build the middle mile. It has open network requirements so that any provider, whether it's a large incumbent or a small new entrant, can get access to that capacity to offer their own services. And so if we have a wireless internet service provider that wants to put up a tower and serve a community, they can do it very cheaply, very effectively, because one of the major barriers to entry of a company like that is getting the transport back to an internet exchange point, and our projects provide that. So we're already seeing that. As I mentioned, I think over 400 interconnection agreements have been signed already across the country with our projects, and every one of those gives an opportunity to private business to step up, take advantage of this investment, and use it to provide services on their own within their community. So we see this multiplying over time as other companies are able to take advantage of this investment.
Thank you. I mean, that's precisely what happened in Rhode Island, was this public investment led to a great public-private partnership and a substantial leveraging of that investment, which I think is happening in other places around the country. But thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Elmers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here today. Mr. Jankowski, my questions are for you. We had a small business health and technology subcommittee. I chair that committee back in February in regard to this issue because of the importance of trying to provide the broadband for small businesses in the rural areas. I am hearing consistently from my constituents back in North Carolina that they have many concerns on the Universal Service Fund and how that plan went forward. Can you explain to us, I know we've already touched on a lot of the small carriers and small businesses. Can you again extend a little bit more on the how much input you received from some of the small rural carriers on putting together that plan?
Yes, and we ran a multi-month open process which consisted not only of asking for written comments from all stakeholders, but workshops, including workshops all over the country, in Nebraska and other states, where we went out and talked directly to carriers and consumers and small businesses. So it's a very important part of our process, and we continue that effort to make sure that we get full input from all stakeholders.
So when you say full input from all stakeholders, are there instances where the agency treats different companies differently based on size? Or have some companies been given more of a lengthier transition period? What kind of transition period have you provided? And I know you mentioned a few moments ago, you know, that you base these on your principles. Can you give us just a little bit of an outline of the principles that you're following when doing so?
Sure. The three core principles behind our reforms are, one, finally getting broadband to the 18 million Americans who live in areas that don't have it. Now, many of those people aren't represented effectively because they're not on broadband. But if we can get broadband to those people, we will spur our economy, help save small communities in rural areas around the country who, without broadband, as you know, really have a challenge, number one. Number two, fiscal responsibility, making sure that we don't grow the overall size of the fund as we do it. And then third, being cognizant of business realities. And so I think everyone would agree that where the fund is subsidizing one company, and there's an unsubsidized competitor, we need to do something about that. Now, of course, that's hard for that company, and so we have an obligation to say, well, what's the transition? How do we do it in a fair way? But indefinitely spending that money in a way that we can't defend and not spending it in areas in North Carolina and other states where there are unserved people and small businesses, that doesn't make sense. So those are the principles that we follow.
And this, my next question really has more to do with regulation. That by far being the biggest issue that my telecom providers, small and alike, are faced with. And you know, with what we have seen, the explosion of business, you know, with entrepreneurs and the internet. You know, at this point, I know there's consideration for significant regulation. Why at this point? When we have seen such growth, such job creation in this area of the economy, why would we be wanting to stifle that with regulation?
Well, of course we wouldn't, and in fact, consistent with the question we got before, the light touch approach is the one we're committed to. Across the broadband sector, investment is up, innovation is up, job creation up, so the story is a good one. We do have situations in the USF area, like the one you mentioned. It is a challenge when a company says, give us public money, but don't have any rules around accountability. And that's not acceptable. If a company is going to ask for public money, it does have to make sure that the system is accountable and that they're spending it wisely. But in general, your philosophy is one that I think is on target.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Next is Ms. Chu, and I apologize for taking out of order.
Okay. Well, this question is for both Commissioner Janikowski and for Secretary Strickling. There's been a great deal of discussion about how we address the current spectrum crunch as the demand for wireless services continues to grow each year. Recently, a May 2012 Cisco report found that wireless will account for 61% of global Internet traffic by 2006, up from 45% in 2011, in 2016, that is. Some have suggested that the spectrum clearing should be the more preferable means for meeting the demand, while others think that spectrum sharing is a more realistic approach, given the high cost and time needed to clear federal agency users. What are your thoughts on this debate, and what would create more opportunities for small business?
Can I start? we obviously manage the government use of spectrum. The FCC handles the commercial use. And we've, since 2010, with the President's executive memorandum directing us to work with the FCC to find 500 megahertz of additional spectrum to make available for commercial broadband uses, we've been doing a very exhaustive study of government spectrum. Early on, we found about 115 megahertz of spectrum that we thought largely could be cleared and made available, and that was passed on to the FCC, and they're working on that spectrum right now. Most recently, a few months ago, we issued a report on the last real piece of beachfront property in terms of government spectrum that the commercial industry would like to use. It's the 1755 to 1850 band, 95 megahertz of very important spectrum. What we found was that because of the increased number of missions that government agencies are performing these days using wireless technologies, we have in that band over 30 separate agencies with over 3,000 separate allocations of spectrum. And we looked at the question of what would be involved in clearing them out entirely, which requires, of course, finding other spectrum to move them into, which is a challenge in and of itself, but also involves a tremendous amount of cost and a tremendous amount of time. And what we found in our reviews that were released a few months ago was that to do it the traditional way of clearing all of that band of all of the existing services, it would take over 10 years, and it would cost probably about $18 billion. We felt in our role as stewards of this spectrum that that was too much money and it was too long. And so we feel that, and plus, as I said, this is the last remaining bit of beachfront property, and we know that the spectrum needs of this nation go far beyond just another 95 megahertz that we might be able to put on the table out of this particular band. So out of that report, we have recommended, and we have already put in process a mechanism to evaluate, are there federal systems that can stay in place in this band and still allow commercial providers to come in and enter the band. We're going system by system, agency by agency, in a work effort that we expect will conclude by January. And what will come out of that will be a mix. There will certainly be services that we know we can move without a lot of difficulty and move the existing service into a spectrum band that probably would not be in question by the commercial industry in any near term. And by this, I'm talking about point-to-point microwave services. On the other hand, we have some very large-scale Department of Defense systems that are very difficult to move, but are also operating intermittently. And the question would be, well, that rather than spending the $5 billion to move the air combat training system, is there a way industry can operate in and around that system so we leave the system in place and allow commercial entry? That's what we're trying to focus on in a very engaged dialogue between industry and the agencies. So these working groups we have meeting involve both agencies as well as private industry to try to see if we can find an accommodation. Long term, I have to tell you that sharing has got to be the path on which we go if we're going to meet the kinds of demands that are being bandied about in the by companies and by the press as we see this continued explosion of demand for spectrum. We have to find a way to do this.
I would just add briefly a few points. One, the premise of your question that we have a spectrum crunch that needs to be addressed for innovation, small businesses, is completely correct. We both agree on that, and I agree with Larry's remarks. The reason we have it is something that we should be proud of. The U.S. is now leading the world in mobile. We're the first country in the world to get to scale at 4G, the next generation of wireless infrastructure. On the innovation side, we're booming. The number of smartphones around the world that have American operating systems in the last 3 years has gone from under 20% to 80%. And around the world, people are using American apps. So the spectrum crunch is being driven by huge increases in demand. In some respects, it's the kind of problem we want to have because more demand is better than less. But it does raise these issues that the Assistant Secretary addressed. I think that we'll need both of the solutions that you mentioned, clearing and sharing. It's not an either-or. I agree with Administrator Strickling that there are enormous opportunities around sharing, good for our commercial sector, also good for federal users as it can be part of a strategy to reduce the gap between the cost and functionality of military communications equipment and commercial equipment. So I share the Administrator's view, the Assistant Secretary's view that this could be a win-win for everyone. but we also need to look at the clearing approach as well.
So the bottom line is we're not going to wait for 10 years before we operate on this.
Absolutely not.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to follow up on some questions, comments that Mr. West made about the regression analysis. And this is both for Mr. Alstein and Mr. Janikowski. Am I saying that right? Apologize. And I have to belabor this because I think of folks in my district. I think of Dale Merton, who is the COO of Toledo Telephone, and some of the challenges they're facing with regard to certainty on the regression analysis. So Mr. Adelstein is sitting right couple seats down from you. Mr. Janikowski, how would you advise him and other lender companies in this who are in this space about how to forecast the risk of long-term loans in the face of caps that change almost annually in ways that really have not been made clear? And that's the kind of the guts of that 650 signatory letter that went to you last week.
Yes, and I would say it's to continue to work with us, and we're working together to increase certainty and predictability so we can get broadband to unserved areas, ensure continued service in existing areas, and honor fiscal responsibility, and importantly, preserve the program. This is a program that some would eliminate, and for some people it's hard to understand why public money would be used to support private companies.
And let me jump in on that, because I think you're right. You know, in terms of mission, yeah, we all want to get there. It's how we do it and making sure we do no harm in the process. I'm talking about small telephone companies who are doing this currently or who have received USDA loans to put infrastructure in, who now are saying we won't be able to survive, and no one's going. It's not profitable. No one's going to cover this area, right? And that's what we're talking about. Who's going to cover those areas that are unsearchable? I guess I would also, to Mr. Adelstein, are you comfortable sitting here today that you know how to project the FCC's caps, how the FCC's caps may change each year? And if not, Mr. Janikowski, are you going to make sure that Mr. Adelstein has that capability ASAP? So I guess it's a two-parter.
Well, thank you. As I mentioned, Mr. West, we do long-term analysis in terms of the revenues in order to justify a loan. Generally, we do a 5-year analysis, so we need to take into account what the regression impacts would be. We do have visibility in 2014, but not beyond. I think it's helpful for borrowers to have some kind of a stop loss, consistent with the no flash cuts approach the Chairman has talked about. He's already made a change in the regression analysis to phase it in more slowly. I think some type of way of making sure that we knew going forward what those changes might be so that we could loan into them would give us additional visibility. So
you're saying you are comfortable then projecting out even if these caps are changing yearly? You're comfortable with that? Well,
we're working with the FCC on it now.
So you're not quite there yet?
Well, we're still in the process of figuring out exactly what the long-term revenues would be in order to make a loan. I mean, we're going through a number of loan packages right now that were pending when the FCC order came out, and we asked those borrowers, those potential borrowers, to resubmit their loan materials based on what the FCC order was. So we're working through those now.
It's interesting you say that, because the more I think about it, it wasn't a grant, it was a loan that this company got, and they're considering not cashing the check, in all honesty, because here on one hand they're being told go for it, let's do it, you've got here's the build out, and on the other hand they're looking at this new proposal saying, do you want us to just go bankrupt on this? I mean, how are we supposed to manage?
We have $36 million in loans we've done in your district alone since I've become administrator. And it's, I think, done an enormous amount to build out broadband to every corner of your district, and that's what our mutual goal is. So we're working with the FCC to make sure we can continue to build out those projects consistent with the fiscal responsibility that the Chairman talked about.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for assembling this distinguished panel. And Mr. Strickland, I'll start with you, and maybe you can help me with something, especially as my friend and colleague from Louisiana raised issues about his rural district and the lack of broadband access and how it affects education and small businesses in the rural areas. Our governor returned an $80 million grant back to the federal government that would have provided over 900 miles of cable and linked our universities. And I think that the question was whether that would compete with private companies. And I'd like to get your opinion on that, and anyone who would offer an opinion on how we are potentially competing with private businesses.
Yes, so the grant you're referring to in Louisiana was a grant that we felt was a very important one that we award at the time we did it, based on the showing that was made to us of the lack of broadband facilities in vast parts of Louisiana. The grant applicant, which was the Board of Regents of Louisiana State University, made a very compelling case that this would add infrastructure and connections to schools and libraries and anchor institutions in parts of the state where we understood they had only received regular telephone service in recent years. So the showing of need was demonstrably there. There was no question about it. What happened with the project was that after the grant was awarded, the state chose to try to change the project in a way that was not going to deliver the benefits on which we had decided to award the grant. And as a result of that, we felt the grant had to be terminated at that point in time. So it's not something we're happy about. We would have liked to have seen the project proceed as it had been proposed to us and submitted to us, but that was the choice of the state not to do it that way.
In your recollection, and if you remember, great. If you don't, that's okay. But in the Board of Regents application, did they give a impact on how many people it would actually increase or provide first-time access to broadband, or the impact to the state? And I will tell you, as a former legislator and as a congressman, the entire legislature, Public Service Commission, and people in the state were very alarmed about the application and the fact that the governor wanted to change the scope of the application. But do you remember the impact or the numbers on what it would do for Louisiana?
I don't recall, but that's an absolute pivotal showing that has to be made in the applications, the showing of need. And there was no question that the state of Louisiana needed this investment and would have benefited from it. Again, as I mentioned earlier, our projects tend to focus on middle mile, and then we depend on private industry to build out the last mile facilities. But again, this would have put a tremendous amount of middle mile infrastructure into very remote parts of Louisiana, where there then would have been an opportunity for private industry to have built off of that and offered service. I believe the potential affected population was quite large. It was quite a large part of the state that was affected by this project.
And oh, I thought you wanted to add something. And I won't stay on it too long, but I absolutely agree with you. I think it was absolutely critical and gave us a great opportunity in a state that's ranked at the bottom in education, the bottom in access to health care, and a bunch of other areas where access to broadband would certainly help us to return $80 million to the federal government when you have a state like that. Troubles us considerably. Let me move on to a different question, and anyone who wants to answer this one can. But how do you envision women-owned and minority-owned businesses participating in the build-out of the broadband infrastructure in rural areas?
Well, we think it's very important. We did a number of outreach efforts before the applications were open, so we ensured that folks were aware of many diverse backgrounds of the opportunity to apply, and we continued to work with them. We really believe it's important that the kind of companies that are taking advantage of these programs reflect the diversity of the United States, and we've been fairly successful. We've been able to get to a lot of remote parts of the country. We're serving 125 persistent poverty counties, which is a large portion of them in the country. And we've been able to get to school children, 1 million school children that are in areas that have school lunch assistance. So we really have targeted those areas, I think, that are hardest to reach. And we hope that those who build out our networks as well also reflect that diversity.
I see my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Janikowski, welcome. I'm sure you've discussed darn near everything I'm going to ask you, but let me just highlight a couple things. This impressive fiber explosion that we've been discussing wouldn't be available without investment from small businesses. The private sector has invested billions to upgrade their networks, and we obviously still have a long way to go, particularly in our rural areas. For the past decade, the FCC's commitment not to regulate fiber services has yielded real results. Following up on the earlier questions, do you plan on regulating fiber optic technology or hybrid technology?
No, we don't plan on changing our approach in this area.
Okay, so it's safe to assume that this less obtrusive approach on fiber does send the right message to the private sector to keep doing what they're doing.
Yes, and in fact, in the last 3 years, investment in infrastructure, wired and wireless in the U.S., and fiber, which supports both wired and wireless, is up very significantly, even in a troubling economy. So the approach is working.
Great, thank you. Chairman Adelstein, the Farm Bill Broadband Loan Program's new interim final rules that were released last March in 2011 still allow loans to be made in areas that are 100% served. Why right now, especially in this environment, are we spending money in areas that already have broadband when Congress has repeatedly instructed you to focus on communities that lack broadband?
We absolutely focus on communities that lack broadband. Congress, in the Farm Bill, directed us to implement new metrics to limit eligibility to areas that have 3 or fewer broadband providers. So the Congress, in the Act, recognized that there might be some broadband there, but they wanted to bring the broadband up to a higher standard. As you indicated in your fiber question, of course, fiber is key, and we want to make sure that the level of quality of service that's going to rural areas is very high, but also giving the highest priority to projects in areas with no broadband at all. And we did that in the regulation, but we also have to make sure the projects are financially feasible. In order to do that, I think it's difficult to do that with no broadband there, but it's also difficult for a project to demonstrate financial feasibility if there's already broadband availability there. So naturally, our program does militate towards places that have less service. If it's already well served, we're not going to do a loan there because there won't be a business case to repay it, and that's how we've kept our default rates very low.
In your estimation, does the program require overbuilding in certain areas?
It does not require it.
Does it lead to it? Has it led to it?
Well, it permits some overlap because, again, broadband doesn't always follow neat lines. And in order to build a business case, it doesn't always make sense just to go to the area that's the most remote, difficult to serve. Absolutely, nobody's been there because there's no revenue. It would be enormously expensive, and there aren't enough customers there to be able to pay that freight. So what networks tend to do is they build over a broader network, and sometimes there will be broadband in parts of that network, but that enables it to build out to the rural areas, the most remote areas, by having essentially a broader network in which to recover the expensive costs that were incurred in building out the network.
Are there more efficient ways to target funding at the areas in most need?
Well, the most efficient way is grant funding, frankly, but that's very difficult to come by given the fiscal situation we find ourselves in. During the Recovery Act, we did have substantial grant money. I think we were able to get to places that otherwise wouldn't be gotten to and create jobs in the process. But at this point, I think that Congress is considering whether to expand grant programs in the Farm Bill as it's being debated. And there's a difficulty, as you know, in getting real budget authority to do that in a significant way.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. I think looks like I'm last in line, so I'm going to throw you some softballs here, and you can let me know if that's true. Chairman Janikowski, the Universal Service Fund was originally designed to ensure telecom services for all Americans, and I represent a very rural district, including those rural and high-cost areas at reasonable rates. So how does phasing the high-cost program into the Connect America Fund and the Mobility Fund advance the objectives of the Universal Service Fund?
It's right at the core of updating the Universal Service Fund for the 21st century, moving from telephone to broadband, and then making sure that the about 18 million Americans who live in areas without broadband infrastructure finally get access to broadband.
Okay. And this is for you, again, Chairman and Mr. Adelstein. Rural carriers have complained that the FCC's USF order will cause them to default on RUS. And I think you said something about this earlier, Mr. Adelstein, but I didn't understand it. To default on RUS loans and impact their investments. Are you aware of this, and am I wrong in this statement?
We are aware of that. A number of our borrowers have come to us and indicated that they could be put in default situation. Some have applied for waivers and have indicated in their public filings that if they did not receive the waiver, they would default. So we have heard those concerns raised.
What's the solution? The
Well,
waiver?
The waiver is certainly something that we had requested of, and the Chairman included in a certain version in his order. So that is certainly the way that we're working with the FCC on these cases to prevent those kind of defaults so that we can protect the taxpayer funding at the same time that we're, as he indicated, reforming the program and moving it into a new direction.
Okay. Well, speaking of the waiver process, it's reforms to the Universal Service High Cost Program were implemented. FCC contends there is a simple $8,000 fee. Now, some of my small carriers argue that besides the fee, extra costs are incurred in order to compile all the data, and actually the cost could range upwards of $300,000. Is that true? And I mean, is this something that's going to put these small carriers at a real disadvantage?
Well, we're committed to making sure that our waiver process is as streamlined as it possibly can be. Where we're talking about annual funding in the millions and millions of dollars, we do have an obligation to make sure that the waivers are appropriate, and that so working with the carriers to make sure we have the information we need is very important.
Okay. Well, and as I stated earlier, I represent a rural district, and you know, obviously there's a lot of discussion going on now about the Verizon Wireless and the talks with Comcast, Time Warner, and all that. My concern always is making sure that rural America is not left behind and they're given access, and there's some concern on this discussion ongoing. So can you comment on how the discussions are going with this marketing agreement or whatever it is, and how it impacts what we're talking about here?
Respectfully, I can't, because talking about a specific pending transaction is something that I can't do.
Okay.
But at a higher level, I'll tell you that certainly we run an open process, and the concerns that have been raised are ones we're taking very seriously.
So are you saying that the agreements, or as things move forward, there's going to be a chance for public comment, public review of what's the agreements that are taking place?
That's happening right now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
With that, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. This committee is going to be closely following the actions of, obviously, the Federal Government when it comes to expanding broadband to small businesses. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that Federal policies don't obstruct the private sector investment in broadband infrastructure. Obviously, this would have a hugely adverse impact on small businesses and their ability to grow. So with that, again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here very much, taking time out of your schedule, and I'd ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, that is so ordered, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.